Hello, and welcome to Chapter 6, History of Schools. This is Part 2. So if you haven't seen 1 yet, go back and watch 1 first. In Part 1, we looked at the evolution of the school system in early America, and then we were looking at minorities, and we began with Native Americans and their experiences in the early school system in the U.S. Now we're going to be moving forward and looking at African Americans. So I'll put myself up here in the corner, and let's move forward. As I'm sure you can all guess, whenever you're looking at the role of education in African Americans in the United States, it is built on a long history of discrimination. So let's start to dive in. And let's start by thinking about how the European colonists' relationship with African Americans was different than their relationship with the Native Americans. Well, how would that be different? Native Americans. Wasn't there something they wanted from those Native Americans? They wanted their land, right? So that put them in a different situation than the African Americans, from whom they didn't have any possessions that they wanted. So African Americans did have a different relationship with those early colonists. They were brought here by force. They were brought here involuntarily. They didn't own land. They didn't have any possessions. But what they did have was a source of labor, especially in the South. The South felt that without slave labor, their economy would not survive, that they needed slaves to be prosperous. So very different relationship. They needed to keep them subordinate. Now, after the Revolutionary War, most African American children in the North attended segregated and inferior schools. Now, you might have just noticed that the words "in the North" in parentheses just magically appeared. I just went in and added that to make sure we knew the area of the country we were talking about. So in the North, they attended these segregated schools that were considered inferior in terms of the quality of education the students were getting and the resources. Now, some bigger cities created what we call charity schools, like New York City and Baltimore and Philadelphia. So these charity schools were created for freed slaves. Boston was one of the first areas where African Americans could attend their regular schools. They did not have segregated schools. So early in the U.S., after the Revolutionary War, Boston was an integrated school system. But most African American children still did not attend these schools because either they felt it was hostile, that they were not well received by the other children, or due to economic situations, their parents simply may have needed them to be working. We saw in Part 1 about child labor and its role during that time. Now, in the South, before the Civil War, it was illegal for African Americans to attend school. Literacy was a punishable crime for slaves. And in fact, I found this little clip here online that in North Carolina, to teach a slave to read or write, or to sell him any book other than the Bible, is punished by 39 lashes or imprisonment if the person who was teaching them was a free Negro. If the person teaching them was white, then they had a fine of $200. They weren't lashed. I found this cartoon from 1839. I want you to look down at the bottom where that arrow is. And note that this cartoon was actually from Zanesville, Ohio, and it shows the way some of these early schools were treated by people in the communities. Now, I ran across a really interesting article while doing this research. So look over here. Notice the smaller print underneath where it says, during the Civil War, 7 black men met in secret to found Parkersburg, West Virginia's first public school. I read that and I thought, I grew up in Parkersburg, West Virginia. I live right across the river from there, but I had never heard this before. So I started reading more. The very first public school in the entire city was one created for African Americans. It was called Sumner School. It still stands to this day. It was, again, an early school, and I loved reading this part. It was the nation's first free school for black children below the Mason-Dixon line. And again, this is in Parkersburg, West Virginia. Now, they did have a small museum there that you could visit, but the building went into a bit of ruin, shall we say, and they've actually been trying to raise money to save the few documents and photos they have related to Sumner School. So just a thought, any of you that have school groups that are looking for projects to volunteer or to help with, this could be a very valuable one to look at. So it was called the Sumnerite African American History Museum. So again, not to take us too far down the rabbit trail, but that is something that is obviously relevant to what we're talking about. All right, so education in the South after the Civil War. The African Americans wanted universal education, and they wanted to control their own education. And I think we saw something very similar with the Native Americans, that idea that they wanted self-determination. They wanted to choose how their children were going to be taught and what they were going to be taught. So after the Civil War, former slaves created and staffed their own schools to teach the children in their areas. And I found this part really interesting. They adopted a classical liberal curriculum. So they went back to some of the curriculum similar to those early Latin grammar schools, and also pulling some from that New England primer. A very challenging curriculum is what they went with. So in the early 1900s, so keep in mind what's going on. We have ex-slaves who've founded their schools. They have a challenging classical curriculum. Then we have white leaders who are starting to question, why do African American children need such a challenging curriculum? Why do they need such advanced study? Maybe instead they should just be teaching them trades. They should be teaching them skills that would better serve the African American children, is what some of these white leaders were saying. A famous person in history, his name is Samuel Chapman Armstrong. He founded what's known as the Hampton Institute in Virginia. And there he brought African Americans in to teach them, not just provide an education, but teach them about the ethic of hard work. He taught teachers and taught them to focus on things like the importance of agriculture and skills and vocations rather than the classical curriculum. Booker T. Washington was a top student from the Hampton Institute. Keep that name in mind, because we will be discussing him a little bit later on in terms of an influencer of curriculum. I just wanted to share one of the quotes by Booker T. Washington. Nothing ever comes to one that is worth having except for a result of hard work. Because remember, if he comes from the Hampton Institute, then his focus is on the idea of the value of effort, the value of a hard day's work. Something else that's going on in the early 1900s, African American children, as we know, were not allowed to attend white schools due to segregation. This was pretty much a nationwide policy. So they had to build their own schools and fund their own schools. The federal government wasn't doing it for them, and most states weren't doing it for them. So they're not allowed to attend the white schools. So to be educated, they really had to take control and do it themselves and pay for it themselves. Then came the movement for desegregation. So the North had integrated a lot of their schools by this time, but the South had not. Plessy versus Ferguson is one of the top important Supreme Court cases. And this is one of the ones that came up saying separate but equal. That it is okay to have separate schooling facilities as long as they are equal. And that allowed schools to continue to be segregated. So this is that landmark case that allowed for segregation, saying again, as long as they're equal, it's fine to have things separated. But the NAACP decided, you know what, we're going to take a legal path to desegregating these schools. And Thurgood Marshall was the lawyer to represent this case. And interesting, he later became the first American on the Supreme Court. But he argued this case in front of the Supreme Court, saying that when it comes to education, separate but equal has no place, and separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. They did not have equal resources. They did not have equal teacher qualifications. That simply there was no equality going on within this separation of educational facilities. So this was the argument in Brown versus Board of Education. It was this landmark case that then led to the desegregation of schools. Here's a short video to kind of put you in this time period.
November 14th, 1960 was the first day of first grade for 6-year-old Ruby Bridges of New Orleans. That was also a memorable date in American history. It was the first day of court-ordered desegregation of the New Orleans public school system. Back in 1954, the Supreme Court declared the racial segregation of public schools unconstitutional. More than a year later, some African-American parents in New Orleans sued the school board for failure to comply with the court's ruling. Finally, after almost 5 years of legal wrangling, a federal order was issued, demanding the gradual desegregation of New Orleans schools, beginning with the first grade. So, in November 1960, Ruby was one of only 4 black students starting first grade at the previously all-white schools. Ruby attended William Frantz Elementary. The other 3 went to another school. Federal marshals escorted Ruby past a rioting white mob into the building. All of the teachers except one refused to teach while a black child was enrolled. And within that first week of classes, nearly all of the white students in the schools had withdrawn. In Ruby's class, she and the teacher were the only 2, and it stayed that way for the rest of the school year. Despite the continued threats and retaliation against her family, Ruby remained at Frantz Elementary, and in 1961, she advanced to the 2nd grade.
I think we can all agree that important moments in history like that and important individuals need to be known. So although Brown versus the Board of Education did state that schools needed to be integrated, this was not necessarily followed by all the states. You can see in New Orleans there, it took them quite some time to actually follow that federal mandate. It wasn't until about 10 years later, when the Civil Rights Act was established, that most schools actually did follow that mandate to integrate. Here's some famous pictures from Little Rock, Arkansas. I'm sure you've probably seen or heard about the Little Rock Nine and the incredible discrimination that they encountered simply trying to go to their integrated school that the law said that they were able to go to. But obviously you can see that the bystanders and many people in the white community disagreed. As schools desegregated, most African-American teachers and principals were left behind. They were not hired by these white schools. There was no longer a need for their segregated schools, so many of them were left without a job. And then now we're going to talk a little bit about Latino Americans. I found it interesting that there was a lot of disagreement early in the history of the United States about how to classify Mexican American students. Were they white? Were they not white? How are you going to classify them? Texas court declared that they were not white. California classified them as white. So where they could attend school and where they could not attend school often differed based upon the state that they lived in. Most state courts did not consider them to be white, so they did attend segregated schools up until the mid-1900s, around the time of the Civil Rights Act. Mexican American students were also not allowed to speak Spanish. What does that remind you of? It sounds a lot like the deculturalization of the Native Americans, who were not allowed to speak their tribal languages in schools. For instance, in Texas, it was illegal to speak any language other than English in your school. Those English-only laws, they hung around until 1968. So that was just a few years before I was born that they finally decided to get rid of that. And I wanted to ask, how many of you have heard of the Mendez versus Westminster School District case? Anyone? Well, if not, I hope you'll find this enlightening. The Mendez versus Westminster School District case was a ruling, one of the first rulings that gave Mexican Americans equal rights in schools. This is another one of those landmark cases. And this was in particular for integration. This was before Brown versus the Board of Education, and it required California schools to allow a Mexican American girl to attend their white school. This case was filed by 5 parents. It shows that sometimes a small number of people can move and change the world. And in the case, it was stated that, and I believe it's down here somewhere, that the methods of segregation prevalent in their schools was hurting their ability to learn English. It was suggesting inferiority among them where none exists. So again, this was prior to Brown versus Board of Education. All right, we've got 2 last topics left. We're going to be looking at teachers and we're going to be looking at curriculum. So first of all, the evolution of teachers. We started off previously, remember, way back in the colonial period. I'd like to point out that during the colonial period, most teachers were male, except for the dame schools. The dame schools were, women working at home. After the Revolutionary War, you started to see more women get recruited to teach and more men being promoted to being the administrators of the school. So you started to see that gender difference. A big and interesting area to look at within the world of the evolution of teachers is teacher behavior. Throughout this time period, early 1800s, late 1900s, teachers were expected to live almost perfect, exemplary moral lives and social behaviors. They were monitored by their principals and their school administrators. They had rules of behavior. Let's take a look at some of these. First of all, their apparel. That it is forbidden for them to wear in public things like bloomers for cycling, skirts slit to expose the ankles, a bustle extended over 10 inches, that in terms of conduct, they could be immediately fired if they smoked, drank, went to any sort of a public dance hall, if they married. They were not allowed to be married. They were to be single women. If they joined any sort of feminist movement, such as suffrage. So again, their behavior was greatly monitored. I'm sure you might have seen this online. This is real. This is 1915 Rules for Teachers. And look at where this is from. West Virginia, a neighbor state. Things like you will not marry. You will not keep company with men. You must be home after 8 p.m. You cannot loiter downstairs in ice cream stores. Ooh, I bet that was some serious time. You may not travel, ride in a carriage with any man other than a relative, dress in bright colors, dye your hair. You can see very, very strict code of conduct for these teachers. Then came the creation of normal schools. Normal schools were institutions to prepare you to become a teacher. They were founded shortly after the common schools, which makes sense. So the common schools were developed, our rudimentary public school system. We needed teachers to teach in them, and we needed to prepare those teachers and do it quickly. So they created 2-year schools to prepare you to come and teach in these schools. And the purpose was to improve the quality of teachers, and they really focused on educational practices in these schools. One of these normal schools was the Tuskegee Normal School. So this was founded by Booker T. Washington. You might recall his name. He was mentioned briefly in part 1. He was a graduate of the Hampton Institute, which you might recall means that he went to a school that focused on training African American teachers to value hard work and to focus on vocational trades. So he graduated from there, went on to become the head of the Tuskegee Normal School for colored teachers. Now, as you can probably guess, because of his training, he prepared African American teachers to work on vocational skills as well as to be self-reliant, and they did focus on things like agriculture and such. There were some in the African American communities who viewed him as a sellout. that he was really working for white industrial America who viewed African Americans as a source of labor rather than as independent thinking leaders. He is a bit of a controversial figure in history because there are also those who see him as being incredibly important to the development of African Americans and the fact that he was the first to lead a school and to train all of these budding teachers. Here's a short video just to talk a little bit about this.
Washington went on to found Tuskegee Institute, which was a major hub of creating the kind of leadership that the South thought appropriate for African Americans. So in agriculture, in industrial training of the industrial arts, he, in a sense, leveraged that institute on the basis that the young people he was training would prove their mettle in society, would prove their worth by their hands and by their heart, and not by agitating for full and equal participation in society.
In fact, as I mentioned before, many African Americans, including W.E.B. Du Bois, who became the founder of the NAACP, argued that schools should be training leaders of the future, not focusing on these types of vocational trainings. And I found some quotes over here from Du Bois that I thought you might find interesting. Like at the bottom, either the United States will destroy ignorance or ignorance will destroy the United States. So Du Bois, I'm sure as you can tell, as the founder of the NAACP, went on to continue to work for rights and freedoms for African Americans. All right, our last topic is going to be influences on school curriculum, on what was actually being taught. When the Industrial Revolution came about, they started to make education more standardized with these common schools, more compartmentalized on the different things that you're studying. And I think you can probably see a little bit of a connection between these two photos here, that they were trying to teach students to follow orders, to be well behaved, to operate on a clock system. And perhaps partially some of this goal here was to help this new immigrant population be ready to work in the factories, to work within industry, and to become disciplined workers who were also literate. One of the movements that came about in education was progressivism. And I know that word is used a lot in different contexts. We're going to focus on progressivism within the education system. And it started with John Dewey. So John Dewey's an educational philosopher, and some of the things that he believed was that schools needed to be more student-centered. They need to focus on hands-on learning, that students are learning by doing, learning by discovery, that curriculum should be guided by what the students are interested in. So rather than stating ahead of time, here are the things you need to learn, you need to see what students are interested in first. I love this quote by him. Education is not an affair of telling and being told, but an active and constructive process. This strongly contradicted the colonial model, which was a bit more top-down, having a set curriculum, having more discipline in the classroom. And then came Sputnik. So if you don't know what Sputnik was the first satellite. And the very first satellite to orbit Earth was put up by Russians, and Americans were dumbfounded. They were horrified. They were upset. They felt like this first giant scientific discovery should have happened in America, not in Russia. And it made them question, what are we doing in our schools? Are we as advanced as we should be? So U.S. leaders were desperate, to say the least, to regain supremacy within science and technology. And so one of the ways they were going to do this was by looking at schools. Dewey's whole notion of progressivism fell out of favor. This idea of student-centered learning and active learning and all of this seemed to be a lot less important than, again, getting that scientific and technical supremacy. So in the light of Sputnik, curriculum changes again, and there's a demand for new techniques, new curricula, more of a focus on science and on math. This is Sputnik down here below. And here you can start to see some of the cartoons and news that people saw of the time period, that this really woke up Americans as to, wow, maybe we aren't the leaders, and led to the National Defense Act.
The National Defense Education Act was signed into law on September 2, 1958, and provided funding to United States educational institutions at all levels. It was an important math and science initiative inaugurated by President Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1958, and motivated to increase the technological sophistication and power of the United States. The act followed a growing national sense that U.S. scientists were falling behind scientists in the Soviet Union, and was catalyzed by the success of the Soviets launching the first ever satellite, Sputnik, the year before on October 4, 1957. U.S. citizens feared that schools in the USSR were superior to American schools, and Congress reacted by adding the act to the U.S. schools to be up to speed. The act authorized funding for 4 years and increased funding for each year. For example, funding increased on 8 program titles from $183 million in 1959 to $222 million in 1960. The NDEA was instituted primarily to stimulate the advancement of education in science, mathematics, and modern foreign languages. However, it also provided aid in other areas, including technical education, area studies, geography, English as a second language, counseling and guidance, school libraries and librarianship, and educational media centers.
So you can see how this moment in history really spurred a push forward in education. And again, this was through the National Defense Education Act of the 1950s, 1958. And the whole focus was to improve teaching within these specialized areas. This was one of the first times that the federal government took a really big step forward in a national curricula. Because remember, schools are supposed to be run by states. But there are times when the federal government does seem to step in and say, we're in charge of things now. And this was one of them. One of the last areas that we're going to look at when it comes to influences on schools is perennialism. So if you think of a plant, a perennial plant is something that comes up every year, right? Okay, perennialism is the belief that there are certain great works of literature and art and religious texts that represent some core knowledge or wisdom of the human race. If you know the name Mortimer Adler or his book, The Paideia Proposal, he is one of the front runners of this idea of perennialism. He's known for the Great Books program. Well, this one was easy for me. I just went downstairs to my bookshelf. My husband is a graduate. He got his master's degree in a Great Books program. So our bookshelf, this entire shelf is just a handful of some of his Mortimer Adler books. Here's one of our series of great books. It is something that I also use in my homeschooling. In fact, I just grabbed this from my bookshelf. There's for younger students, it starts with the Good Books program. Then it turns into the Great Books and Great Ideas program. There's a small private school here in Marietta that actually my husband and I wrote the entire curriculum for, based upon the Great Books ideas. So it is one that I do believe in. It is this idea of, again, that curriculum should be universal, that there are certain great works that human beings should be aware of that tap into different subjects. In fact, Mortimer Adler created this set of books called the Synopticon, where he went through every masterpiece in literature and art and religion and tied together all of the topics that they have in common, creating these great ideas. So again, it does emphasize classic works. It also emphasizes teachings of values and moral character. That was another big piece that we put into both the curriculum we wrote, as well as my homeschooling program, using fairy tales, using classic literature to teach morals, to teach character, to teach virtues. Oops, sorry. And then finally, they're also big proponents of what's called the Socratic method of teaching, of using deep, enriching discussions to help teach your students. If you are interested in these Great Books programs, there are some great places to look online. There's greatbooks.org, and there are 2 colleges. St. John's College, which is both out of Annapolis, Maryland, and New Mexico, Santa Fe, I believe, and the University of Chicago. Their programs are based entirely on the Great Books program. All right, so that is it for Chapter 6, History of Education. I hope you found it as interesting as I did, and thanks for paying attention.